Imagine for a second that you install just the most expensive, technologically advanced security system on the planet for your house.
We're talking sensors, reinforced steel, the whole 9 yards.
Right, that works. Billions of dollars. But there is a massive flaw in the code.
Okay.
Every single time the alarm goes off, the system automatically sends this highly detailed text message to the burglars.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It tells them exactly which doors held firm and, exactly which windows you forgot to lock. It doesn't just fail to keep a secret. It actually actively tutors the people trying to break in.
Which completely inverts the foundational premise of military strategy.
Exactly.
Because the expectation for centuries has been that your stockpile, your endurance, is your most closely guarded secret.
Right. They aren't supposed to know.
Exactly. The adversary is supposed to guess how much ammunition you have left. They're supposed to bleed themselves, dry testing your defenses, never quite knowing if the next wave will be the one that finally breaks through.
Or if they're just, throwing resources into a bottomless pit.
Precisely.
Well, today we're exploring a scenario where that guessing game has been entirely eliminated. Welcome to today's deep dive.
Glad to be here.
We've got a fascinating and honestly deeply unsettling new research paper from Cleston House in front of us today. It's titled The Audited Reserve.
It's a heavy read, but a crucial one.
It really is. And our mission for this deep dive is to trace how a very specific, almost bureaucratic legal vacuum in the United States has inadvertently handed foreign adversaries a live, open-source, perfectly accurate ledger of America's most critical defensive munitions.
Yeah, to fully grasp the architecture of this problem, you really have to understand the prequel to this research.
Right, the previous paper.
Yes, a paper called the Discretionary Reserve, because the entire crisis we are about to unpack hinges on one missing piece of legislation.
Just one missing law?
Just one. See, the United States possesses a finite, heavily constrained stock of ballistic missile interceptors, systems like the Patriot and PAC-3.
Right.
But there's no legal rule, no statute, and no binding doctrine that ranks who gets them.
Okay, let's ground that in reality for a second. If you have, say, Taiwan staring down the Chinese military, Israel engaged in a multi-front conflict in the Middle East, and Ukraine fighting off daily Russian bombardments.
They're all pulling from the exact same pool of Patriot missiles.
The exact same pool. And because Congress has never passed a law saying, for example, in a concurrent crisis, Ally A gets 50%, Ally B gets 30%, and Ally C gets 20%. The allocation is based purely on case-by-case executive discretion.
Oh, boy.
The White House basically just decides on Tuesday who gets the shipment on Wednesday.
And the intention behind that lack of legislation is flexibility.
Huh.
I mean, the executive branch historically resists being boxed in by rigid laws during a fast-moving crisis.
That makes sense. They want agility.
Right. They want the agility to surge weapons wherever the fire burns hottest. But the core thesis of the Audited Reserve is that this exact discretion is what educates the adversary.
How so?
Because choices made without a governed rule still create patterns.
Ah.
And when you refuse to publish a statutory rule, the adversary just watches those patterns to reverse engineer your limits.
They audit the outcomes.
Exactly. They audit the outcomes.
And this isn't just, an abstract theory about defense budgets. The paper anchors this dynamic in the real-world bloody consequences of a very specific event just a couple of weeks ago.
Yes, the night of July 5th to 6th.
July 5th to 6th, 2026. Russia launched a massive strike package at Ukraine, primarily targeting the capital, Kyiv.
A package of 419 missiles and drones.
419. Just staggering.
It was the fourth major large-scale strike package launched just since the beginning of June. And you really have to look at the composition of that package to understand the intelligence failure that followed.
Okay, let's break that down.
Because the defense didn't just collapse under the weight of 419 munitions. Actually, against the vast majority of the threats, the Ukrainian air defense grid performed flawlessly.
Yeah, the numbers from the Ukrainian Air Force are just stunning. So out of 351 strike drones, these are the Shahed, Gerbera, and Atalmas models, the Defender shot down 326.
Which is incredible.
It is. That is a 93% interception rate against a massive swarm.
And it gets better with the cruise missiles.
Right. 33 KH-101 cruise missiles were launched, and 31 were shot down, 94%. They also faced 6 Kalib cruise missiles, and they shot down all 6, 100%.
Exactly. If you stop reading the damage assessment right there, you are looking at a textbook example of an impenetrable airspace.
But the walls of the fortress held while the roof was completely missing.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Because the final category of the attack consisted of 23 Iskander-M and S-400 ballistic missiles, and out of those 23 ballistics, exactly 0 were intercepted.
0.
0. At least 20 people died, and the destruction was catastrophic, entirely caused by the munitions that bypassed the grid.
And you see, a selective failure of that magnitude is exponentially worse for operational security than a general failure.
Why is that? I mean, a failure is a failure, right?
Well, think about it. If Kyiv had just been overwhelmed entirely, if drones, cruise missiles, and ballistics all rained down simultaneously, the Russian targeting staff would simply conclude that they saturated the radar systems.
Oh, they would just assume they sent too much at once.
Right. They'd assume the defenders were blinded by the sheer volume of targets. They wouldn't learn anything highly specific about the Ukrainian inventory.
Oh, I get it. Because the failure was isolated to a single variable.
Yes.
Okay, let's unpack the physics of why that matters so much. Because a lot of people hear missile and think they're all basically the same thing.
They definitely aren't.
Right. Shooting down a Shahed drone or a cruise missile is a fundamentally different task than stopping an Iskander ballistic missile.
Radically different. Drones and most cruise missiles, they fly close to the ground and they fly relatively slowly. They can be tracked and engaged by a vast layered network of cheaper, more abundant systems. We are talking about Gepard anti-aircraft guns, shoulder-fired Stingers, NASAMS, even mobile fire groups driving around in pickup trucks with heavy machine guns.
You can just throw a wall of lead in the air to stop a drone.
Exactly. But a ballistic missile operates on an entirely different physical profile. It is launched high into the atmosphere, often skimming the edge of space, and then comes down on its target at terminal velocity.
So we're talking about crazy speeds here.
Speeds exceeding Mach 6, coming in at a steep angle.
Yeah.
You cannot shoot that down with a machine gun.
Right.
You cannot shoot it down with a standard surface-to-air missile. Engaging a ballistic missile is like trying to shoot a bullet out of the sky with another bullet while looking through a straw.
That is a wild image. So the only system in the Ukrainian arsenal capable of intercepting that specific threat is the Patriot-class interceptor.
The only one.
So by swatting away the hundreds of drones and cruise missiles, but letting 23 out of 23 ballistics hit the ground, the defense grid involuntarily published a highly specific inventory check.
Exactly.
They broadcasted to Moscow that the Patriot magazines, and only the Patriot magazines, were completely empty.
The paper refers to this as pricing the scarcity. It told the adversary the exact limit of that specific munition.
Now, I read that and immediately hit a logical roadblock.
Okay, what was it?
If the emptiness of the magazine is this obvious, this mathematically clear, why wouldn't Washington foresee it? I mean, I hear the phrase ungoverned reserve, and it implies the Pentagon doesn't know what it has.
Sure, I can see why you'd think that.
But if you look at the U.S. Munitions Acceleration Council's fiscal 2027 priority list, the U.S. is spending astronomical amounts of money.
Oh, massive amounts.
They are buying $7 billion worth of PAC-3 interceptors. That's 1,636 of them. Another $4.8 billion for 373 head interceptors. Total missile procurement is up 188% to $70.5 billion. We literally count these weapons down to the cent. So how is it ungoverned?
You're identifying the central trap that policymakers fall into. You are conflating accounting with governing.
Okay, explain the difference.
The paper explicitly defines these multi-billion-dollar appropriations bills not as forward-looking strategies, but as audited confessions of expenditure.
Audited confessions of expenditure, meaning they don't tell us what we are going to do with the missiles, they just prove we already fired the last batch.
Precisely. Take the memo justifying that $4.8 billion for HAD interceptors.
Yeah.
The language explicitly states it is required to replenish interceptors expended in the previous year. It is a credit card bill.
Wow.
And the expenditures they are paying off are historically unprecedented. The paper points to Operation Epic Fury, the opening 96 hours of the war with Iran, where U.S. forces burned through over 5,000 munitions in just 4 days.
To put that in perspective for you, the listener, 5,000 advanced munitions in 96 hours is an industrial nightmare.
Absolute nightmare.
That is a rate of fire that physically empties global stockpiles faster than the logistics chain can even load the empty ships to send back for more.
And that was followed by the June 2025 defense of Israel, which consumed an estimated 49% of all THAAD interceptors ever delivered in history.
Half the historical supply.
Half of it, along with a fifth of the global SM-3 inventory. So we know exactly what we bought, and we know exactly how violently fast we consumed it.
Right.
But maintaining a spreadsheet of your purchases does not mean you have a governing rule for the replacements coming off the assembly line.
So the U.S. logs the budget items, tracks the contracts, but refuses to codify the one thing that matters, the priority list.
Exactly.
And we don't have a statutory ranking that tells Israel, Taiwan, and Ukraine exactly where they stand in line for the next batch of 1,600 Patriots. The allocation remains purely discretionary.
And as we discussed, a firm rule constrains the owner. It binds the hands of the executive branch.
Right.
But a rule also structures what outsiders can learn. If you declare your priorities, the adversary has to navigate your declared architecture.
Makes sense.
Discretion frees the executive branch to wing it during a crisis, but it leaves the adversary with no choice but to study the outcomes to determine your actual strategy.
If you don't announce your strategy, your actions become your strategy by default.
Exactly.
The enemy just watches where the missiles go, counts the explosions in the sky, and keeps the ledger for you.
And this introduces the concept of combat as an involuntary disclosure channel.
Involuntary disclosure.
Right. Historically, munitions stockpiles are opaque. They're state secrets. China, for instance, treats quantitative ambiguity regarding its nuclear arsenal as a foundational pillar of its deterrence.
If nobody knows exactly how many warheads you have, they have to assume the worst.
Exactly. Opacity is an asset.
Okay, I understand the theory, but let's pressure test it in a modern combat environment. If opacity is so valuable, why can't Ukraine just manufacture it? During World War II, the British used extensive deception campaigns. They built fake inflatable tanks. They censored the press.
Ghost army, yeah.
Right. Why couldn't Kyiv just lie? If the Patriot racks are empty, publish a fake interception table claiming a 100% success rate, plant some twisted metal in a field, and scare the Russian targeting staff into thinking the magazine is infinitely deep.
It's a fair question. But deception in this specific environment is physically and structurally impossible.
Why?
First, you have the sensory density of the modern battlefield. The attacker is not relying on the defender's press releases. They have overhead satellite imagery.
Yeah.
They have assets on the ground.
Sure.
And most importantly, they have geolocated smartphone footage uploaded to Telegram within seconds of an impact.
Ah, social media.
Yeah, you cannot hide a Mach 6 ballistic missile detonating a city block. If Ukraine claims they intercepted all 23 Iskanders, but Moscow has satellite imagery of 23 smoking craters, where their targets used to be, the bluff evaporates instantly.
The physics of the weapon makes the outcome undeniable. You can't put a tarp over a destroyed power plant.
Exactly. But the paper introduces an even more restrictive mechanism preventing deception, which it calls the dual audience trap.
The dual audience trap. Okay.
The ledger of interceptions has two sets of readers who demand completely opposite narratives.
What are they?
Well, you have the audience in Moscow, who you desperately want to deceive into believing your shield is impenetrable. But you also have the audience in Washington and Brussels, who you desperately need to convince that your shield is cracking.
Oh. If Ukraine bluffs Moscow, they accidentally bluff the U.S. Congress.
Precisely. A self-sufficient military can afford to bluff because they build their own weapons. A dependent defender is entirely reliant on foreign resupply.
So they have to show their hand.
Right. If Ukraine fakes a deep magazine to deter Russian strikes, the politicians in Washington will look at those same interception tables and conclude that Kyiv is fine and that the next batch of Patriot missiles should be diverted to Taiwan instead. A dependent defender is condemned to publish its hunger.
Condemned to publish its hunger. Wow. They have to bleed in public to justify the bandages.
Sadly, yes.
So the nightly interception tables, these highly granular lists of exactly what was launched and what was intercepted, serve as both the desperate plea for Allied resupply and the perfectly calibrated intelligence feed for the enemy's targeting staff.
Exactly. And the behavioral evidence that the adversary is aggressively using this feed is overwhelming.
The paper really digs into this, doesn't it?
It does. It meticulously maps the interception rates over the first half of 2026, and the adversary's response is chillingly rational.
Let's track that curve. So in January 2025, Russia fired 28 ballistic missiles in a month.
Okay.
A year later, January 2026, they hit a monthly record of 91 ballistics.
A huge spike.
Massive!
Yeah.
But throughout the spring of 2026, March and April, the defense held. The interception rate was hovering around 90%. The Patriots were basically chewing through massive salvos.
But then May hits.
When May hits, and the overall interception rate drops to 53%.
The stress fractures begin to show.
Yeah. Then June 2026. Drone intercepts are still at 90%, cruise missiles at 89%, but the ballistic intercept line plummets to 40%.
And then the floor falls out.
July 1st to July 14th, across two massive strike packages, the tables yield a horrifying result. Just 4 intercepts out of 47 ballistic missiles, a 9% interception rate.
Now look at the adversary's tempo during that collapse. The paper isolates the two packages in early July. On the night of July 1st to 2nd, Russia launched 24 ballistic missiles. The defense downed 4, an 83% penetration rate.
The voltage on the electric fence is almost gone.
4 nights later, July 5th to 6th, the adversary returns. Ukrainian analysts noted that this second strike perfectly replicated the routes, altitudes, and tactics of the first one.
They didn't change anything?
Nothing. They fired 23 ballistic missiles and the defense down 0, 100% penetration.
Brutal.
An attacker who replicates a complex package just 4 days later, keeping the variables constant while the defense zeroes out, is not executing a blind bombardment. They are executing a measurement.
So they tested the fence on July 1st, saw the power failing, waited exactly 4 days, and then just walked right through the open gate.
Exactly. The Institute for the Study of War, the ISW, assessed this behavior and noted that Russian forces purposefully decreased the number of ballistic missiles in each package as the interception rate declined.
Which seems counterintuitive, right? Shrinking the salvo is a signal of absolute confidence.
Yeah.
You would normally think an attacker would want to fire more missiles to guarantee a hit?
Only if you are trying to overcome a functioning defense grid through saturation.
Right.
If, via the public ledger, that the defense is empty, you don't need to waste 50 missiles to secure a few hits. You can fire 23, knowing all 23 will strike their targets. The defender has inadvertently allowed the attacker to conserve their inventory.
And it isn't just the size of the salvo, it's the rhythm of the attacks.
Historically, massive Russian missile strikes operated on a 10-day tempo.
10 days.
That 10-day window was dictated by their own logistical constraints, moving heavy munitions from deep storage to the launch sites, programming the flight paths, fueling the systems.
But in July, they compressed that 10-day logistical rhythm down to just 4 days. Why rush?
Because the tempo was no longer dictated by the attacker's supply chain, it was synchronized to exploit the defender's resupply calendar.
They knew the shipment was delayed.
Exactly. The paper quotes a Ukrainian defense analyst stating that Russia aggressively husbanded their ballistic missiles specifically while Ukraine waited on delayed Patriot deliveries.
Wow.
They concentrated their firepower inside the publicly announced window of vulnerability, ensuring maximum destruction before the Allied transport planes could arrive.
Which brings us to the brutal arithmetic of industrial capacity. We are talking about two different engines of war here. Military intelligence estimates that Russia's defense industrial base is churning out 60 to 65 Iskander ballistic missiles every single month.
Which is an astonishing rate of production for a heavy, complex, terminal velocity weapon.
60 to 65 a month. Now compare that to the global output of the weapon designed to stop it. The baseline production rate for PAC-3 interceptors is roughly 650 missiles a year.
600 a year versus 65 a month.
Right. And the U.S. military strictly reserves half of those 650 PAC-3s for its own forces, meaning the actual pool available to the rest of the Allied world is closer to 300.
It's a massive discrepancy.
When the adversary is producing targets faster than the combined Allied industrial base can produce interceptors, and they synchronize their launches to perfectly exploit the gaps in your delivery schedule, you are not experiencing a tactical setback. You are in a structural crisis.
Now, analytical rigor requires us to test this hypothesis. We cannot simply look at a compressed timeline and shrinking salvos and automatically declare that the enemy is reading the ledger.
Fair point.
The paper methodically addresses the rival explanations floating around the open source intelligence community.
Let's run through those alternatives. I want to try and break the audited reserve theory. First alternative, conservation. We know Russia likes to hoard ballistic missiles during the summer so they can launch massive, grid-crippling attacks against Ukrainian energy infrastructure in the dead of winter. Couldn't the shrinking salvos just be a hoarding strategy?
The fatal flaw in the hoarding theory is the tempo. If your strategic goal is to save missiles for a campaign 6 months away, your firing rate should slow down. You spread your attacks out.
Right, you wouldn't compress them.
Instead, the strike's compressed from a 10-day interval into a highly aggressive 4-day surge. You do not conduct a rapid, high-volume surge if your primary objective is long-term conservation.
That makes sense.
Furthermore, The decision to hoard missiles right up until the exact moment the Patriot deliveries stalled and then unleash them into the gap requires a synchronization that implies an audit is taking place anyway.
Okay, second theory. The drone sponge.
Let's hear it.
Russia sent over 350 Shahed drones in that July 5th attack. Maybe the primary strategy is simply using cheap drones to exhaust the expensive interceptors, and the ballistic missile success is just a lucky byproduct of the sponge tactic.
Forcing interceptor expenditure with cheap drones is undeniably a core Russian tactic. I mean, it happens all the time. But the drone sponge acts as a constant baseline pressure. It does not explain the precise timing of the ballistic strikes.
I see.
The decision to execute a concentrated ballistic surge within a 4-day window, perfectly timed to the exact moment the defense collapsed, demonstrates a level of specific measurement that goes far beyond simply throwing drones at a radar until it turns off.
Okay, third theory, dispersal.
Okay.
Ukraine has been running a highly effective deep strike campaign, using their own drones to hit Russian ammunition depots and airfields hundreds of miles behind the front lines.
Very effectively, yeah.
So if you were Moscow, you don't want a massive stockpile of Iskanders sitting in one place waiting to be blown up, so you shrink the salvos to disperse the risk.
Well, the geometry of dispersal contradicts the behavior we saw. Dispersing risk requires spreading your assets and your firing schedules out across time and space.
Like keeping them spread out.
Exactly. The July strikes did the opposite. They demonstrated a heavy concentration of fire, compressed into a tiny temporal window, originating from established launch areas. That is not how a military disperses. It is how a military exploits a breach.
The final theory, and perhaps the most cynical, information warfare.
This one is interesting.
What if this was purely theater? A staged demonstration designed to show the world, right as the NATO summit in Ankara was kicking off, that Russian weapons can easily penetrate Kyiv's defenses.
The paper dissects this perfectly. In order to stage a demonstration proving your missiles can bypass a defense grid, you must possess advanced knowledge that the grid is down. You cannot launch a propaganda strike unless you are already certain the magazine is empty. Therefore, the information warfare theory isn't an alternative to the audit hypothesis. It is entirely dependent on it.
Wow. So all the alternative theories basically fall apart when subjected to the timeline. The interception rate collapsed. The collapse was involuntarily published. The attacker read the data. And the tempo and composition of their strikes adapted perfectly to the results.
Exactly. It is the only explanation that harmonizes all the data points.
And to maintain analytical fairness, the paper highlights that this audit mechanism is actually symmetric. Ukraine is running its own audit on the Russian military.
Right. The transparency cuts both ways.
Ukraine relentlessly tracks Russia's expenditure of S-300 surface-to-air missiles. Western intelligence analysts, using Ukrainian data, have modeled Moscow's interceptor burn rate and concluded that their expenditure is highly unsustainable.
And Ukraine acts on that data. Because they know where the Russian air defense grid is depleted, they have been launching deep strikes into previously untouched Russian territory.
Yes.
In mid-July, they hit the Salavat refinery deep inside Russia. They started picking off the gasoline fleet in the Sea of Azov to the point where commercial ship tracking data showed transponder activity halving because the Russian vessels were terrified of being targeted.
So both sides are engaged in a relentless, mathematically driven audit of the other's capabilities.
But there's a difference in how they handle it, right? Exactly. The asymmetry lies entirely in governance and disclosure. Russia goes to extreme lengths to hide its ledger. The United States, by refusing to establish a statutory allocation law, leaves its reserve ungoverned.
And Ukraine is stuck in the middle.
Right. Trapped by its reliance on Western supply, Ukraine is structurally forced to publish the daily balance of that ungoverned account.
The U.S. declines to keep a ledger, but provides all the necessary data entries for the adversary to maintain it.
Well said.
So if the audit is running at full operational tempo, how does the U.S. defense industrial base intend to fix the underlying math? How do you overcome the discrepancy of 65 Iskanders a month versus 650 Patriots a year?
The paper argues that the U.S. defense budget has effectively bifurcated into two entirely distinct philosophies. We are operating two different munitions economies simultaneously.
Let's start with the offensive side, what the paper calls the strike economy.
The strike economy is rapidly embracing mass and speed. The Pentagon has bypassed traditional defense contractors and signed fixed-price framework agreements with non-traditional agile tech vendors.
Companies like Anduril and Castellian.
Yes. The goal is to build vast quantities of weapons at a fraction of the historical cost.
And the procurement numbers are just wild. They have plans to acquire 10,000 low-cost cruise missiles in 3 years. They are spinning up a program for 12,000 Blackbeard hypersonic missiles over 5 years. The sponsors of these programs explicitly refer to the strategy as delivering affordable mass.
So on the strike side, the industrial base is adapting, but the defense economy is trapped in an entirely different paradigm. Defense remains exquisite, highly rationed, and crippled by bottlenecks.
You cannot spin up a Silicon Valley startup to build a Patriot missile in a garage.
Exactly. A single PAC-3 MSE interceptor costs roughly $4.3 million.
Yeah.
A Shad interceptor costs nearly $13 million.
$13 million for one interceptor.
One interceptor. And the issue isn't just the financial cost, it's the physical complexity of the manufacturing process. The production of PAC-3 interceptors is severely bottlenecked by seeker manufacturing.
Let's pull that apart. What exactly makes a seeker so hard to build? Why can we stamp out 10,000 cruise missiles, but we struggle to build 1,000 Patriots?
Well, the seeker is the ultra-precise, miniaturized radar guidance system housed in the nose cone of the interceptor.
Okay.
To execute a kinetic kill a bullet, hitting a bullet at Mach 6, the seeker has to process targeting data in fractions of a millisecond while surviving the extreme gravitational forces and thermal friction of terminal velocity.
Wow.
Assembling a seeker is akin to building a Swiss watch inside a vacuum chamber, using materials that require highly specialized supply chains. Stamping out a low-cost strike drone is like assembling plastic toys by comparison.
Lockheed Martin, the prime contractor, is aiming to ramp up PAC-3 production to 2,000 units a year, but that target is years away. It's slated for 2030.
And even that target assumes they can solve the concurrent crisis in the solid rocket motor industrial base, which the paper dryly notes is still the subject of urgent industrial studies rather than actual factory floor solutions.
So no actual fix yet.
Right. The U.S. is attempting to fight a modern war of mass using an economy of exquisite scarcity.
The paper uses a comparison here that truly highlights the absurdity of the math. Japan possesses a licensed production line to build Patriot missiles domestically.
Yes.
Japan's entire annual output of Patriots is around 70 missiles. A full year of highly advanced Japanese industrial manufacturing yields 70 interceptors. That covers exactly one large Russian raid on Kyiv.
Meanwhile, before the magazines went dry, Ukraine's burn rate was roughly 60 interceptors a month. And the Ukrainian Air Force grimly referred to that 60-a-month rate as a starvation ration.
A starvation ration consumes the entire annual output of a major allied nation every 4 weeks.
It's unsustainable.
And when the Allies scrambled to put together an emergency resupply in mid-July to stop the bleeding in Kyiv, the total number of interceptors reportedly en route was fewer than 20, fewer than the single ballistic salvo that devastated the capital on July 5th.
And because the physical missiles cannot be manufactured fast enough, Washington and its European allies have pivoted to a different strategy. One, the paper critically labels the illusion of exits.
If you can't hand your ally a physical missile, you hand them a piece of paper granting them the right to build it themselves.
The paper impartially dissects 3 major political announcements made in mid-July, all ostensibly designed to cure the interceptor shortage through licensing and co-development.
Let's go through them. Announcement number 1. At the NATO summit in Ankara, President Trump announced that the U.S. will grant Ukraine a license to produce Patriot interceptors domestically, suggesting that production lines could be spinning up in 2 to 3 months.
That's the first one.
Announcement number 2. France declared it is granting Ukraine licenses to manufacture French-designed Aster 30 interceptors and Skal LP cruise missiles.
Okay.
Announcement number 3. A 10-nation European coalition launched Freyoja, a co-development program to build a Ukrainian-designed, low-cost interceptor called Firepoint, aiming to finally bring affordable mass to the defense economy.
Politically, these announcements generate excellent headlines. They project unity and resolve. But the paper evaluates these exits through the only metric that matters to the adversary conducting the audit. Do any of these interceptors arrive inside the operational window? Do they alter the math on the battlefield this year?
And what's the answer?
The answer across all 3 initiatives is unequivocally no.
Let's start with the Ankara announcement. The idea of setting up a Patriot manufacturing line in an active war zone in 60 to 90 days.
The paper highlights several fatal flaws with that timeline. The announcement failed to specify which variant of the Patriot was being licensed. Furthermore, by the president's own admission at the summit, the U.S. manufacturer holding the intellectual property hadn't even been formally notified of the arrangement yet.
Wait, so the company that builds the Swiss watch in the vacuum chamber didn't even know they were supposed to be teaching someone else how to do it?
Exactly. And the promised 2 to 3 month timeline fundamentally contradicts decades of established industrial reality.
You can't just throw up a factory in 2 months.
You cannot bypass the seeker manufacturing choke point or the solid rocket motor supply chain simply by signing a licensing document.
What about the French roadmap?
It faces similar hurdles. Negotiating a complex defense partnership is a necessary step, sure, but delivering actual interceptors off a non-existent assembly line will take years.
Okay, what about the Frey-J coalition? The attempt to build a cheap, mass-produced interceptor. That sounds more promising.
Even there, the timeline is deeply fractured. The political rhetoric surrounding Frey-J hopes for an operational system in 12 months. However, the realistic industrial reporting coming from the developers themselves targets late 2027 for the first successful ballistic intercept test.
Late 2027. It is the equivalent of handing a drowning sailor the blueprints for a life jacket, congratulating them on securing the intellectual property rights and telling them they just need to source the neoprene and sew it together while they tread water.
Exactly. These announcements provide an illusion of governance. They do not govern the existing finite stock of interceptors, and they do not blind the adversary's audit.
So they don't solve the immediate problem at all.
In fact, as the ISW assessed, these highly publicized long-term development announcements serve primarily to give the adversary a firm deadline.
A deadline. They broadcast to Moscow. You have a completely unhindered window of exploitation until late 2027 before any new production lines actually alter the math.
Exactly. And the paper notes, just as a contextual backdrop to this chaos, that right in the middle of these hollow announcements on July 15th, Ukraine dismissed its defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov.
A leadership reshuffle at the exact moment the logistical backbone is breaking.
So if the physical manufacturing base cannot be accelerated and licensing is merely an illusion, what concrete actions can the U.S. and its allies take to regain control of the ledger? How do you close the audit when you have no new missiles to deploy?
The paper outlines 3 highly specific, incredibly difficult policy demands, and crucially, none of them require inventing a new technology or waiting for a factory to open. They are pure choices of governance.
Exactly.
The first demand is a fundamental shift in the disclosure doctrine.
The paper argues that Ukraine and its Western allies must immediately cease the reflexive nightly granularity of their interception tables.
Stop publishing the exact numbers every night.
Right. The current practice of publishing exact launch and kill ratios is a munitions choice masquerading as a communication strategy.
Because there is a lethal exchange rate at play, every time you publish a perfectly accurate table to generate urgency in Western capitals, you are trading away your operational security to hand the Russian targeting staff a free calibration tool.
Now, the paper does not advocate for complete silence, because in an era of satellite imagery and social media, total concealment of a ballistic impact is impossible. But it demands the intentional introduction of noise.
Noise? Like what?
Publish aggregated data over weekly or monthly timelines rather than nightly. Delay the release of statistics. Maintain the advocacy lever for Western politicians because the physical need for the weapons remains absolute, but introduce enough friction to disrupt the adversary's immediate battle damage assessment loop.
Okay, demand number 2, a radical overhaul of the firing doctrine.
This is where the policy demands become incredibly bloody. For decades, the standard doctrinal rule for Patriot batteries, hardwired into the training of the crews, has been the shoot-shoot-look policy.
Right.
You fire 2 interceptors at every incoming ballistic target to statistically guarantee a kill.
Which makes perfect sense when you are defending a forward operating base and you have a massive supply ship anchored off the coast. But operations research dictates that a fixed 2-shot rule is mathematically disastrous when your inventory is severely constrained.
Exactly. If a battery commander has 10 interceptors left and 20 ballistic targets appear on the radar, adhering to the shoot-shoot-look doctrine means firing 2 interceptors at the first 5 targets.
Right.
You guarantee 5 kills, but you absolutely guarantee that the remaining 15 targets penetrate the airspace completely untouched.
The demand is for an inventory-indexed engagement policy.
The firing doctrine must formally acknowledge the reality of the empty magazine. And the paper is unflinchingly honest about the consequences of this shift. Adopting a leaner doctrine, perhaps firing only 1 interceptor per target, or deliberately allowing certain targets to strike less critical infrastructure to preserve interceptors for command nodes, inherently raises the risk of leakage.
Leakage being the clinical military term for a Mach 6 weapon detonating in a civilian population center.
Yes. The political leadership must explicitly accept that horrific risk. They have to put in writing that they are willing to absorb a certain percentage of leaked missiles to stretch the inventory, rather than forcing the air defense operators to blindly empty the racks and hope the mass magically resolves itself.
Because right now, every launch decision is a disclosure decision,
Yeah.
and the doctrine forces them to disclose emptiness.
Exactly.
Demand number 3 brings us back to the original sin highlighted in the prequel paper, the allocation law.
The U.S. Congress must draft and pass a statutory rule that explicitly ranks who receives the interceptors. The era of pure executive discretion must end.
Because discretion simply outsources the discovery of your priorities to the adversary.
A statutory ranking undoubtedly constrains the president. It forces excruciatingly difficult, highly public choices about which ally is deemed more vital. But it functions as a profound tool of counterintelligence.
How so?
If Congress publishes a law stating Priority 1 is U.S. forces in the Pacific, Priority 2 is Taiwan, Priority 3 is Israel, Priority 4 is Ukraine, the adversary is suddenly forced to navigate a declared, rigid architecture.
They can't just guess anymore.
Right. They can no longer manipulate your deployment strategy by simply testing the magazine salvo by salvo to see where the White House sends the next shipment.
Yeah.
You rip the authorship of the rules out of the enemy's hands.
Fixing the disclosure doctrine, rewriting the firing doctrine, and passing an allocation law.
Yeah.
These are massive, politically fraught tasks.
Absolutely massive.
But they all operate on a shared assumption that the current crisis is a failure of governance. They assume that Washington desperately wants to fix this, but is simply fumbling the bureaucratic execution. The paper, however, forces us to confront a fourth possibility. And this section of the analysis is genuinely unsettling.
It is the darkest, most cynical, analytical inference in the entire document.
What if this chaotic, ungoverned exit from European skies isn't a failure at all? What if it is the actual preference of the United States government?
Well, look objectively at the pattern of behavior in Washington. The U.S. aggressively pushes for licensing agreements instead of deploying its own organic stocks. It architects complex purchase mechanisms where European allies foot the bill.
Right.
It heavily encourages the formation of European coalitions like for IRJ to build their own systems. And all of this occurs against a relentless drumbeat of official warnings from the Pentagon that expending exquisite missile defense assets in Europe and the Middle East is fundamentally mortgaging American deterrence in the Pacific against China.
The implication is that Washington privately desires for Europe to take over the burden of defending Europe, allowing the U.S. to hoard its finite PAC-3 production entirely for a potential conflict over Taiwan.
If that hypothesis holds, and the paper presents it not as absolute fact, but as a theory that perfectly aligns with the observable data, then quietly ranking the Pacific theater above the European theater constitutes arguably the single largest strategic allocation pivot in modern geopolitical history.
It fundamentally reshapes the global security architecture. But it's the method of execution that is so damning.
Because they aren't executing the pivot by statute. They aren't formally announcing it at NATO summits. They are executing it by drift.
By drift.
It is an unlegislated, unannounced withdrawal, leaving the allies and the adversary to decipher the new reality through the bloody outcomes on the ground. They are allowing the magazines to run dry to force Europe to shoulder the burden, without ever having to absorb the domestic and diplomatic political damage of explicitly stating you are on your own.
The paper's normative conclusion on this point is scathing. It dictates that a superpower intending to sustain its presence in a theater must make that presence sustainable by writing a governing rule. Conversely, a superpower intending to exit a theater must make that exit honest, also by writing a governing rule. Executing a strategic withdrawal via drift, conducting an exit at the tempo of hollow licensing announcements, entirely legible to the Russian targeting staff but cloaked in deniability to your own allies, is not just dishonest, it is profoundly dangerous.
Because regardless of whether the situation in Kiev is the result of a tragic bureaucratic fumble or a quiet, deeply cynical pivot to the Pacific, the outcome on the ground is identical. The ledger has been opened, read, and verified.
The paper is careful to acknowledge the limits of open-source intelligence, of course. The public ledger is inherently noisy. The exact numbers might have slight margins of error.
Yeah, truly.
But as they point out, an auditor doesn't need perfect down to the decimal precision. They just need a direction. And across 5 weeks in the summer of 2026, the ballistic share of Russian strike packages shrank. the logistical tempo compressed from 10 days to 4, and the Patriot-class interception rate plummeted from 90% to absolute zero.
The direction of the ledger is undeniable. And this brings us to the core thesis of the entire deep dive. A reserve that the law declines to count does not go uncounted.
It simply changes accountants.
Exactly. Because the United States refused to legally govern its stock, the adversary mapped the limits of American industrial endurance using the brutal, undeniable arithmetic of the daily salvo.
It forces a profound recalibration of how we view national security in the 21st century, and it leaves you, the listener, with a final, highly provocative thought to explore. If active kinetic missile defense inherently creates an unavoidable, publicly transparent ledger of a nation's vulnerabilities, are we entering an era where defensive interceptors, these incredibly expensive marvels of engineering, are actually strategic liabilities?
If firing a Patriot missile today simply provides the enemy with the exact mathematical formula required to defeat you tomorrow, the utility of the weapon system collapses.
Will nations eventually abandon these exquisite interceptors entirely? In the proxy wars of the future, will we see modern militaries abandon the concept of a defensive shield and rely purely on the threat of mutually assured, mass-produced drone strikes to keep the peace? A future where the shield is discarded for the sword simply because the sword doesn't have to publish its bank statements every time it is swung.
It is a deeply unsettling paradigm shift.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Audited Reserve. The mechanics of modern conflict are often buried deep in the data, but as we saw over the skies of Kyiv, the math always finds a way to the surface.